I was 14 when this occurred, and I'm 22 now. I still remember it in crisp detail though, and it freaks me out to this day, thinking what might have happened if things had turned out just a bit differently. School was out for the summer, and I had convinced my mom to send me to Russia for a couple of months to visit my grandparents. We'd moved to North America when I was little, and I hadn't ever been back much since. Plus, I thought it would be fun being on my first trip abroad all by myself. She agreed, and off I went on my first solo transatlantic journey. My grandparents are very great people and have always spoiled my mother and I rotten. They were ecstatic their only granddaughter wanted to visit them, so they planned a fun vacation of their own with me for a month after I arrived, to a popular beach resort city in Turkey. And we were to stay at a 5-star resort in Ankara for 2 weeks. I thought that was spectacular, getting to travel to not just one but 2 countries in a single summer, and to a fancy exotic place like Turkey at that. I was dying to go. Full disclosure though, when I arrived to Russia, it was not really what I had been expecting. My grandparents are really protective people, so I couldn't do much or go anywhere by myself. That meant it got boring pretty fast, and I spent most of my days just playing PSP in my room. I was very accustomed to being active, you see, and I wanted to do lots of things like go jogging, which I'd done every day at home. I gave my grandparents a bit of a hard time about that, since they wouldn't let me go alone, and naturally they couldn't keep up with me due to their age. After about a month of this, the time came to go to Turkey together. I was super excited to finally get some freedom and a change of scenery. I had been pent up at home for far too long. The resort they had picked was sprawled out over a fairly large area. However, it was all very well secured and isolated from the rest of the city. There was also a huge garden on the property as well, which was very well suited for jogging. This time, I also had my own room separate from my grandparents too, so I took the opportunity to go off by myself and explore the grounds a bit. Most of the time, I would jog in the mornings when it was a bit cooler. I would go with my big old iPod, so I couldn't hear anything that was going on around me. I figured it was really safe since it was a really nice hotel with lots of tourists around as well. Then, I started to notice him, a pretty innocuous-seeming gardener in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing this dark green uniform. I remember he kind of reminded me of like a shriveled old date from too many years in the sun. He would always wave or say something in broken English as I passed by, while he trimmed the shrubs or mowed the lawn. I would politely wave back, smile, and nod, but didn't really pay him much attention. Fast forward to about 10 days of this, and now I was really enjoying myself. It was fun to swim in the pool and the sea, the food was really great. And my grandparents had eased up a lot so I could do a lot more by myself. They didn't know about my morning runs in the gardens though, and I was not going to tell them because I was sure they would not approve. One morning around 7 a.m. while I'm jogging, I see that gardener again. This time though, it's clear he's trying to get my attention specifically. He waves at me and yells something, so I stop and pull out my earphones, trying to figure out what he wants. Now, I know he works for the hotel, so I didn't really suspect anything. He waved at me again and motioned for me to come a bit closer. I was very confused, but I figured he wanted to tell me something, so I politely approached him. He was standing at the edge of a trail that went deeper into the gardens and off into the foliage. He was smiling and gesturing, and I could see he was holding something in his hand. I noticed he was holding a rose and extending it to me. At this point, I was confused and a little bit freaked out about what the hell he was thinking. I stayed put. Usually, the hotel staff there were chatty but nice enough. My grandparents would always get pulled into various conversations with them about things. I figured this was something of the same like. I didn't want to be rude, but I still wanted to be on my way without offending this old man. He handed me the flower and I took it, thinking maybe he wanted to show me some roses that were in bloom or something. He kept waving and gesturing like he wanted me to follow him, and stupidly I walked a bit closer. He had another flower in his hand and backed away more. Then, suddenly he stopped and started to lower it a little. That's when I noticed he was holding his other hand behind his back, and he was clearly holding something. I looked up ahead to the trail to see this little hidden-away cabin type thing where I assumed they kept their gardening supplies. Something clicked in my head then, and I began to slowly back away. The man saw me do that and tried to smile, then moved the hand he'd been holding behind his back while lunging toward me. I saw he was clearly holding some kind of rag. Without hesitation, I dropped the rose he had handed me, turned around, and sprinted at full speed. I didn't even stop to look back. I just ran like mad back to the hotel. It was not until the doors closed behind me and I was among other people that I looked back to see if the man had followed me. I couldn't see him anymore though. My heart was beating like crazy. I went back to my hotel room and waited for my grandparents to wake up. I never told them about any of what happened that day and spent the rest of my vacation glued to their side. I thought if I'd said anything, they would get even more paranoid about my safety and blame me for wandering off on my own. Also, I really loved them and I kinda didn't want to ruin the remaining days for them. I saw the gardener once more on the beach. I remember seeing him talking to a security guard. I grew very uncomfortable and sunk into my sun chair as I saw him. He looked over to me and smiled. I scowled at him as he mouthed the word Rosa tauntingly and smiled again. I still remember the anger bubbling in my stomach and how much I wanted to cleave his face in. I just froze there and stared though. He walked away, and I went back to pretending nothing ever happened. Needless to say, I never went on any more morning jogs, and neither did I want to until long after that summer had ended and I'd returned back home. Okay, so years of watching and reading about true crime has led me to be extra cautious and always on the lookout for people who are out of place or acting odd. I believe this has helped me from several bad encounters, and this is probably the worst of them. I was a junior in college at a local university that was located in the city. The campus was about a mile wide, and I lived just over a mile away from it. I lived in an apartment building that was owned by the university, so only students lived there. It was known as the poor kids' apartments and was the farthest from campus. It was also in a fairly bad part of town. The apartments had recently had issues with break-ins, so I was extra cautious about who I held the door open for. The door to the elevators was one that locked when it closed, and only people who lived there had the keys. Sometimes, though, people held the door to save you needing to grab your key. It was about 6 p.m. one night, and I was just returning home from class. I had planned on just stopping at my apartment and then leaving to drive to my mom's house for the weekend. I worked about 40 minutes away near my mom's home, so I tended to stay there on weekends anyway. As I was approaching the elevator door, I noticed that someone was holding it open for a group of us. As I was walking towards it, I noticed one of the people he'd held it open for did not appear to be a college student. Not only was he much older, in his early 40s or so, but he looked homeless for lack of better words. He was extremely dirty and was wearing dirty clothes as well. Obviously, he stood out to me, but apparently not to the other people in the elevator because no one was really watching him except for me. I watched to see what floor he would push when he walked in, but he didn't push a floor button at all. Big red flag right away. I was on the very top floor, and I was one of the last people to enter. I noticed I was the only one to push that floor button. Fuck, if this guy didn't get out on the lower floor, he was definitely up to something. As the floors started to open and people started to get out, I noticed he was now looking right at me, not getting off at any of the other stops. Before long, it was just me and him. I had to think fast because the fact he didn't press my floor but had entered before me, and the fact that he appeared out of place, were both huge red flags. I decided I would let him out of the elevator first. Then he would have the choice of left or right. If he chose left, I could run right and get to my door. I got my key ready and let him out. He hesitated for a moment and I pretended to be stuck looking for something in my purse. He got out and went left. Awesome. I head right and sprint right into my apartment, which was located fairly close to the elevator. I glance back just as I'm walking in and see him standing in front of a random door, looking at me. I went into my room and locked the door right away. I grabbed the few things I needed and kept thinking about how weird that was. I almost started to let myself think that maybe he was dating someone in one of the other apartments. I started to try and rationalize his behavior, but I knew this was just strange. I grabbed my things and headed back out. I made sure to double-check the hallway before going to the elevator as well. It was empty. Thank God. I get back in the elevator and take it down to the lobby. I go to get out, when who do I see getting in with a brand new group of people? That same guy. What the fuck? Now I knew for sure he was not supposed to be here. He saw me, and his eyes grew wide immediately. I went to pull out my phone because I knew I couldn't just let him wander around here. I was about to call the cops while walking out of the lobby when I ran into the security guard who watches our building after a certain time. I told him everything I'd seen. He decided to contact the police and have them waiting for the man when he got back down. He said he would go up and try to find him as well. He told me I did the right thing. I still felt bad that someone else could have potentially been in danger. I hoped he was only a thief and not some sort of rapist or murderer. I didn't hear anything else about it after, and never ran into that same security guard again, so I can't say what happened for sure. I'd luckily caught a good look at him, so I hope my description helped find him at least. He might have known I was going to do something though, and aborted his mission before he got caught. Either way, I always tell people to watch out for stuff like that. Stuff that we always call red flags around here. A few years back, my husband and I were living in an apartment in Brooklyn. One night, we decided to check our neighborhood's sex offender registry and discovered an offender lived in our building. It wasn't really a big deal to us, as we didn't have any children at the time, but I should mention that this guy was one creepy-looking dude. I'm talking about those wild hair, crazy eyes kind of creeper. You know, the real scary kind. We would often see the guy walking around the building or the neighborhood every now and then. He even set up a fruit stand for a while and would wildly yell at people as they passed by. He never really bothered us though, so we mostly didn't give him a second thought. At the time, I was working a pretty crazy job where I would be at work really late every night and have to take a taxi home at the end. On those nights, my husband would stay up late and wait for me to arrive home. I was a bit brain dead when I would get home after a 20-hour shift, so sometimes it would take me a while to find my keys, and my husband would have to let me in. One night, I had texted I was leaving the office around 3 a.m. About half an hour later, my husband could hear our door handle jiggling. Assuming it was me, he got up to go let me in. Something, however, made him look out the peephole first. There he saw him, the sex offender, completely naked, standing on the other side of the door. As soon as he sensed my husband looking out, the man stopped jiggling the handle. He looked up and put his eyeball right up to the peephole, trying to gaze in, as if he could tell my husband was looking at him right now. For some reason I don't really understand, my husband opened the door. As soon as he did this, the guy tried to force himself into the apartment. Eventually he beat the man back and got the door closed. Then he called me. I was about a mile away from our building when I got that call, and I was terrified. It must have been quite obvious, because as we arrived to the building, the taxi driver asked if he should walk me to the front door. I told him yes, I would very much appreciate that. He stood with me until my husband came outside to walk me in. We lived on the 6th floor, and from the moment we went in, you could hear someone running up and down the staircase. We ran to the elevator and jumped in, pressing the door close button over and over until it started to move. When we got to about the 3rd floor, the floor where the sex offender was at the time, he began to bang on the elevator doors trying to get in. We heard him run to the staircase and start running up the stairs to catch us. When we got to our apartment, I called the cops to report this terrifying situation. It took them 2 hours just to arrive, and by that time the guy had already picked up his clothes and gone home. The cops didn't even come inside the building. They made us go outside and didn't even get out of their car. When I explained what happened, they simply responded by saying, "You live in Brooklyn, get used to it." Eventually, we moved out of that building, but whenever we go back to that neighborhood, we still see that guy at his fruit stand, yelling at people as they walk by. So this story didn't happen to me. It actually happened to my very good friend who we'll call Dan. Dan is a 5'10" man from Maryland. He had a very strange sense of humor and was a very smart but all-around good guy. Anyway, we went to the same university. I'm gonna tell this story as best as I can remember, so please bear with me. Dan moved into his dorm room before his roommate did our freshman year. Dan had everything all moved in and had settled in completely. Just as he sat down, his roommate showed up to move everything in. His roommate, we'll call him Brian, introduced himself and his mother and father, who were helping him move. He seemed just like any other person. Dan decided to help his new roommate move everything in, since he didn't know anyone yet and was from a different state. Dan and Brian's family get down to their car, as Brian stayed behind in the room to put things away. This is the first red flag in this story. As they were opening the trunk, Brian's father looked at Dan directly in the face and whispered, "Good luck." Dan thought he meant with classes. He said thanks and grabbed a box, but boy was he wrong. Dan carried that box upstairs and into the room, where Brian proceeded to flip out. He screamed about how that box had his special ingredients for a project he was doing, and Dan had probably broken it. Weird, but everyone has their quirks. They finished moving Brian in and his parents said goodbye, and again, Brian's dad told Dan good luck. It was really weird. Anyway, a couple of guys came by the door to ask if they wanted to go eat. Dan said sure, but Brian stayed behind to finish unpacking his things. While Dan was out, he got a call from Brian, asking if he would mind if he smoked weed in the room. Dan, being that he wanted to work for the CDC, said absolutely not. Brian screamed something unintelligible and hung up the phone. He called back a few minutes later and asked if he could smoke weed in the closet at least. Again, Dan said no. Brian hung up without a word, and Dan and his friends decided to go make sure he wasn't actually smoking in the room. When they arrived, they found him hiding in the closet like a goblin eating the weed. Weird as hell, right? Not even close to as bad as this will get though. As time continued on, at night, Brian would wake Dan up by standing beside his bed, standing over him, then asking him a single question. Dan would answer, and Brian would walk back to his bed and fall asleep. This happened every night for a week. At this point, Brian had moved in an entire toolbox full of wrenches, screwdrivers, hammers, nails, screws, an assortment of power tools as well. These weren't the kinds of things you'd need with you in a college dorm room. During this entire week, Brian also never left the room. The only time he would move was to eat and go to the bathroom. About 4 days before the week where dorm room changes could be made, Brian woke Dan up in the middle of the night and asked him how he felt about gay people. Dan said he didn't really care what anyone did, and it was fine with him. When Dan woke up the next morning, Brian was sitting in a chair directly by his head, staring at his sleeping face. Of course, he instinctively yelled out, "What the fuck are you doing?" Brian replied, "I think I'm starting to have feelings for you. You need to move out. I don't want you getting hurt during what's coming." After that, Dan left and didn't sleep in his room for a couple of days until he could move. Unfortunately though, there were no open rooms, so he couldn't. During this time, Brian started to follow Dan around. He would sleep in the closet with his tools, making something. Dan eventually convinced the head of the dorm to let him move into the now empty room next door, after 3 weeks in what he described as pure hell. Dan moved to the room next door, so no big deal, right? Wrong. 2 days later, Dan got a knock at the door at 9 a.m. Thinking it was Brian coming to fuck with him, he screamed out, "What the fuck do you want?" He answered the door in his boxers. At the door, though, there were 4 state police troopers in full hazmat gear. The man in front said, "Not who you were expecting, huh?" At least someone there had a sense of humor. They let Dan put some clothes on, then let him out the door. At the end of the hallway was Brian in handcuffs. Turns out Brian had been building pipe bombs and other sorts of explosives in the dorm room while Dan was away at class. After Dan had moved out, he took over the other bed and the closet for his bomb-making activities. The reason the hazmat team was there was because Brian had spilled liquid mercury all over the floor, and they were afraid it had seeped into the other rooms. When they went through all of Brian's things, they found a plan that also had guns hidden around the city. This kid had planned a massive attack. On a special note, though, he had written Dan's name down with a heart drawn around it, and wrote specifically, "Do not kill." Brian is obviously in prison now. I think I was about 18 years old when I first joined the online dating community. One of my friends had convinced me to sign up since I had just gone through a terrible breakup. I was still technically in high school, but only about 2 months from graduation. As I was clicking through one of the dating sites on my phone, I came across someone who seemed decent looking enough and fairly normal based on what I could tell from his profile. It said he was the son of a local cop, whose name I'll leave out because he's well known around these parts. We'll call him Officer V. We'll call his son Ren. Ren had just moved in with his dad from Florida and was looking to meet some new people. We chatted online for a while, then decided to meet up and go for a walk. We met up at a local ice cream shop and then walked around the downtown area getting to know each other a bit. Now, right off the bat meeting him, I was not super into him. I know nerves can get the best of people though, so I decided to give him another chance. I was a member of the marching band in high school, and we always did the local parades for Memorial Day and such like that. Well, Ren and I had been texting all day talking about meeting up for a picnic or some such after I was done with those parades. When I told Ren we were just finishing up and I needed to get home and get clean before we went out, that's when things took a turn for the creepy. He insisted on picking me up from the end of the parade, and after 10 minutes of arguing, I finally convinced him that no, he would not pick me up and would in fact wait for me to change and get cleaned up first. After I was done getting changed, I gave him my address and said he could come pick me up if he'd like. Not even 3 minutes later, he was already waiting outside. When I hopped into his car, I smelled something awful, something that can only be described as rotting and dead. I'm a messy person, sure, but I've never let my car get that gross on the inside, much less letting a date see it in that state. There were food wrappers everywhere, dirty laundry. It looked as though this guy had been living out of this car. When I asked him what we would be doing for the evening, he said we were going out to dinner, but he wanted to show me something first. You see, we lived near the 3rd largest national military cemetery in the US, and that's where this guy took me. I would have understood, being as it was Memorial Day, wanting to make a quick stop and pay respects to those who had served, but there was no paying respect being done here. We drove through the cemetery, and he pointed out every single grave he was even remotely related to. To make matters worse, we drove through 4 cemeteries, 4 of them. When we left the last one, I thought we could finally get on with the day. Boy, was I wrong. We went back to his house, and I asked if we were still going to dinner. Well, yeah, but we have to wait for my dad, Officer V. He's taking us there. I was a good kid and never got into too much trouble, but the thought of being stuck in a restaurant with a cop watching me was more than a little unnerving. Why hadn't the guy told me this in the first place? As we were sitting on the couch watching TV, waiting for Officer V to come home, R decided it was a good time to try to make a move on me. He leaned in to kiss me and attempted to say something cute before doing so. I immediately turned my face away because of the awful stench emitting from this guy's mouth. I've dated smokers before and cigarette breath didn't really bother me, but this scent was indescribable. It was like cigarette breath on steroids. That's the only way I can say this. Thankfully, moments later, his father walked in and announced he was ready to go. After a few brief questions about my age and making sure it was okay for him to take me across state lines, we left for dinner. The entire meal, R didn't say a single word. Instead, his father basically interrogated me. Thankfully, that dinner was short. After the meal, I texted one of my friends to tell her I needed a way out of this situation. I told her to call me and pretend to be upset. As it turned out, Officer V was dating her mother, unbeknownst to me. So Ren already knew who she was quite well, in fact. I told Ren I needed to go because my friend was really upset and needed my help. Well, he downright refused to take me back to my car so I could go home, even though the only way to get to her house was to drive directly past mine where my car was parked. After that, an argument ensued about him not taking me home. He dropped me off at her house instead, and I immediately jumped out of the car without saying goodbye or thank you. At this point, I was sure Ren must have gotten the hint I was most certainly not interested. I thought I would be in the clear. His tours of the cemeteries and refusal to take me back to my car so I could go home were huge red flags. I knew this was not someone I wanted to be dating, let alone have him in my life. I blocked him on the site and deleted his number as well. The following weeks got progressively creepier though. He would somehow call and text my number all the time, even though he knew I would not answer. He would come to the baseball games I worked at and just stand there watching me. A few times I even had to have the coach throw him out because he was bothering the team. He called me once and I had my friend screen the call and blatantly tell him I was not interested and to stop doing this. He still didn't get the hint. The calls and texts continued for weeks and weeks, and I would even notice him driving by my house at all times of the day sometimes. I only ever ran into him in person once after that, at a local bar and pizza shop. I was at the bar with some friends when I noticed him walk in. As he came up behind me to talk to me, I turned my head and clearly ignored him and acted like I had neither seen or heard him. He stood there for a few minutes in silence behind me, waiting. Then he just walked away, and I've not seen or heard from him since. My friend often tells me how creepy he still is, as her mother and Officer V are now married. Word is, Ren recently got married as well. I feel so bad for that poor girl. I just hope he isn't such a creep to her like he was to me.